Welcome everybody. Oh my God, this group has gotten huge. You can't hear me. I can turn this stuff up, but people are also going to have to help me by not getting too spread out, or not expecting me to repeat something because you're 30 feet behind everybody else. I'm going to say a little thing about subjects for these monthly walks through the garden. We come up with a topic. I never feel like we have to follow it religiously. Certainly if we walk past a plant of interest to you, you can ask a question about that. And this time of year, you never know what there's going to be to see in the garden, because we could be, I know a year ago in January, it was a bitterly cold day and I thought Chris might even cancel it, but as he said, he never cancels anything. But you know, with the warm weather we've had for the last almost 2 weeks, I guess, there are a lot of really wonderful things blooming in the garden. So even though it's not sticking to the topic of architectural plants, I'm certainly going to point them out.
Well, you said points of interest.
Yeah, well, that's why I included that, so I didn't have to waste any time by standing here and saying what I'm saying. So, well, maybe I've blathered on enough. Of course, the one thing I always want to say at the beginning of this, if you have questions, please ask them. I always feel that the information, the answer to your question might be the information that's most valuable to you. I'll probably at times today, is this still working? It sounds like it's not working now. I guess there's a little bit of reverb over there. I'll probably at times say architectural trees, but really my focus from the standpoint of architectural plants is more general than just architectural trees. We'll wait for the train to go by. You can edit all this out. From a garden design standpoint, architectural plants are really valuable because they add, really exciting, distinct shapes in the garden. A lot of plants, especially herbaceous perennials, don't have any distinct shape, and so it's nice to have some plants that do have really distinct shapes to contrast with the bulk of other plants in the garden. And one of the real common shapes in an architectural plant are columnar plants. This is a purple leaf selection, a columnar selection of the European beech, which is a plant that generally doesn't do well here. I have wondered, and maybe it's in our computer database, I have wondered if this might be grafted on our native beech, because that would give it a root system that would enable it to grow well here. But regardless, it's a very striking shape that you can enjoy year round. I don't think that shape disappears this time of year when it's leafless.
If I may add, Doug, we did have a graduate student back in the day, about the time that was planted, that did graft the European onto the North American one. I just don't know if that was included in it, but he was working on the project. I just don't know if anything ever came out of it. And
that's a good point. And yesterday.
Time goes by fast.
Yeah, time flies by. I spent quite a bit of time just walking around the Arboretum, and I saw an English holly, which is another plant that often doesn't thrive here. But years ago, Pat McCracken was grafting those onto Nellie R. Stevens holly to give them a very strong root system. And that plant was now 20 feet or more or taller. Over on this corner is another tightly columnar deciduous tree. That's a selection of our sweet gum, liquid amber styraciflua. And I know the sweet gum fruit can be a nuisance. Plant it somewhere out in the middle of nowhere where you don't have to deal with the fruit, but it's a really striking shape in the garden year round. large shrub here in bloom is one of our native, almost said honeysuckles, witch hazels. Our two most common species are Camellia virginiana, which is native to this part of the country, and this is the Ozark witch hazel, Camellia Vernalis, Vernalis meaning of spring, but it's really a winter, sometime from early winter to midwinter bloomer. That is a pretty typical color, sort of slightly rusty orange, and it illustrates a really good point about placing witch hazels in your garden, especially the orange and red ones. Place them where you can view them with them being backlit by the sun. It's like stained glass that doesn't stand out unless it's backlit. If it's this time of year when you might have red twig dogwoods or the coral bark maples in the garden, they're not translucent like this, so you want them located where you'll see them, where the sun is shining on the surface that you're looking at as opposed to through, because they're opaque. The sun in the winter has a much shorter arc through the sky, and most of the day it's shining south. So if you place things like coral bark maples south of from where you're going to see them most often, then they'll be instead of just being like reddish, they'll be like, the color will really pop if they're lit up by the sun. Yellow witch hazels sort of stand out whether they're backlit or not, but the red and the orange ones really pop backlit. Okay. Yeah.
Does that one hang on to its leaves as much as the native one does? I mean, the one that's native here?
The question was, does Camellia Vernalis hold on to its leaves? I don't think I can answer that question because that might vary from plant to plant. The species might vary. But yes, there are a number. Most of the witch hazels that are in the nursery trade are selections of man-made hybrids. They're Camellias intermedia. They're hybrids between two Asian species. And some of those will hold on to their brown leaves. They won't shed them. And a week ago, I'm going to use the name they've chosen for themselves, the Border Babes, the group of volunteers that take care of the mixed border. They spent the first part of their time here last week sharpening all their pruning shears. And then they went out in the garden, and I noticed let's say there were 8 of them that morning, standing around one witch hazel plucking off all the leaves, because that's a good thing to know about a witch hazel cultivar, because I would tend to not want to plant one that holds on to its leaves. That varies tremendously from cultivar to cultivar. We haven't stripped any leaves off of this, so you can see for the most part it has dropped its leaves on its own. A year ago I can actually see it from here. If you see a tiny bit of yellow about as far as you can see there without going out into Burrell Road, that's I think one of the best of the hybrid witch hazels. That's one called Wisley Supreme. Yeah, Wisley Supreme. That started blooming maybe about a month ago, and it will go all winter. And it's a lovely clear yellow. I don't remember if it's fragrant. Some witch hazels are and some aren't. We'll take a few steps this way. And anybody want to tell me that this is forsythia? Okay. Most people don't distinguish forsythia from winter jasmine. This is a true jasmine. We associate fragrance with jasmines. Not all jasmines are fragrant. This one is not fragrant. But I love this plant. Some people call it winter jasmine or January jasmine. It often starts by the end of December. And it can bloom for a very long period of time, but in a typical winter, it'll bloom in a warm spell. Cold spell will end it, destroy the flowers that are open, and the next warm spell, the buds that hadn't already opened will open. So you'll get many, even months of bloom out of it. You can tell it's winter jasmine and not forsythia because it has 5 petals. Forsythia always has 4. And this also has very green stems. The common forsythias have sort of brownish stems. This doesn't get much taller than it is. It'll spread. The stems are sort of arching and they'll root wherever they touch the ground. This plant was removed from the winter garden. I don't quite understand why, but I thought, well, this steep bank would benefit from somebody that's sort of spreading along and holding the soil. Plus, I just enjoy the flowers. I mentioned how this will bloom through every warm spell. I should have pointed out that pink Prunus mume, but we'll probably see a bunch. There's another one, that's Peggy Clark, and Peggy Clark often starts blooming in December, but again, if it turns really cold, it'll kill the open buds, and then new buds will open the next time the weather warms up. And most of the Prunus mumes, the flowering apricots, are very fragrant.
What is its light requirement? The winter jasmine, the question was, what are the light requirements of winter jasmine?
This is pretty much full sun all day. It's love sun. It'll still bloom fairly well in lightly shaded areas. It's also tough as whole, get out, very drought tolerant. I wouldn't plant it in a soggy spot, but beyond that, it'll take almost anything you throw its way.
This is one of the plants that the Raleigh Parks Department has planted in the median on 440, up in those raised berms, and it's had no problem over there.
If you're going down Wade Avenue towards whatever the highway is that goes through Raleigh,
Capital.
yeah, almost by the time you get there, there's a couple banks that are just covered, and I'm sure they're in full bloom
They
today.
are.
They are?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Home today.
Yeah. A lot of people don't like the plant. I don't quite understand it. I just love anything that blooms this time of year. People often see crocus or snowdrops blooming this time of year, and they'll say things like, gosh, the weather is weird, there's blooming out of season. This, the bloom season for both crocus and snowdrops starts in the fall. There are species that bloom, in fall or through the winter months, and then the latest ones are the spring flowering ones. This is Crocus imperati. It's the Imperati, I think it was an Italian doctor, that's his family name. And this is the cultivar de Jager. The de Jagers are Dutch bulb nurseries. And this is one that is really persistent. In Elizabeth Lawrence's garden in Charlotte, there's a clump of this blooming, I'm sure today, that Elizabeth Lawrence planted, and she died in 1985. I don't know how many years it lived there while she was still alive, but 1985 is quite a few years ago now, and it's still there performing well. It's one that doesn't seem to be quite as readily available from the Dutch bulb vendors nowadays, but used to be, but I'm sure you'll find it occasionally. It's quite fragrant. I'll hand that and pass it around. And the outside, the flower almost disappears when it's closed up, first thing in the morning on a cloudy day, because the outer part of the three outer petals are sort of tan colored. They're very pretty, but you can easily overlook them. Not a, strongly architectural, but the coral berries or Indian currants are a plant that I never see anywhere, and this fruit display lasts all winter long, which also suggests that it's not a plant that's feeding a lot of birds, since they're not stripping the fruit off, but for winter color it's really valuable. Our native Indian currant, they have a really long name. The genus is Symphoricarpus, and our native one is Symphoricarpus orbiculatus, referring to, I guess, the shape of the fruit. This is a hybrid one, and often the other parent is the snowberry, which is another Symphoricarpus with big white fruit. Now, I grew up in northern New Jersey, and that was a shrub you saw in old gardens, big white knobbly fruit that lasted all winter, but the snowberry doesn't do really well down here, but the hybrids between the two are really good garden performers. Now, they're not necessarily for a small garden. They're like the winter jasmine in that they're always making a wider and wider mass, but if you had, I did say mass and not mess, but if you had like a big sunny bank to cover, even a lightly shaded bank, they would be great. Now, no one's asked yet if deer eat it. I think deer leave jasmines alone, but I have known them to be pretty hard on our native coralberry. It's odd that a plant has fruit that the birds don't, or some creature doesn't come along and eat at all.
It's one of my favorites at our wreath workshop because the berries don't fall off.
Good to know.
You'd think calicarpa might be nice, but those berries are usually all over the place by the time the workshop's over. But these hang up. Well, I wouldn't eat them, but...
But see, plants want their fruit to be eaten because that's how they get dispersed. And indeed, a lot of our most horrible invasive exotic plants, see, the stems are very flexible, so you can make your own little wreath right away. Many of our most serious invasive exotic plants are plants that have fruit that the birds eat and then disperse. You know, think of privet. We don't think of Japanese honeysuckle as having a fruit because it's a small black fruit you don't notice too much in the winter months, but the mockingbirds will sit there all winter eating it. Eleagnus, multiflora rose, they're all plants that the birds eat the fruit and then spread them. And indeed, some of those, like multiflora rose, were intentionally planted for wildlife. You know, both the shelter of the shrub itself, but also the fruit. So when we introduce plants, ornamental plants with showy fruit, we have to be especially careful that they're not something that the birds are going to eat and spread around if it's an exotic plant. And maybe I should define the term exotic because I think the term exotic sounds like something other than it is. Exotic is the opposite of native. It's not, like she was an exotic showgirl or something like that. Just, from the standpoint of if we talk about a plant being a native, the plant that's not a native is an exotic plant. It's from some other, the other side of the road or the, other side of the country or, some other country. Any questions?
Could that seed possibly be toxic, or it's just not desirable because it's?
I've never heard anything about the fruit. Maybe it's something that fed some creatures like Carolina parakeets or passenger pigeons that are no longer with us.
Yeah,
So,
maybe so.
yeah. But plants have different means of dispersing seeds, and one of them is having an edible fruit. A lot of hollies seeds, not the fruit, the seeds often have very complex germination requirements, like the seed isn't even mature when the fruit first ripens, but maybe after it's gone through the winter, the seed is closer to maturity, so then the fruit becomes more palatable or something like that. The weeping habit is another real striking architectural form. Many of them are, just as showy in the summer as in the winter, but some of them I think really stand out in the winter landscape. Some of them look like, if you ever wanted to do a nightmare garden, I think some of them would be good for that. They sort of look like they might, reach out like in The Wizard of Oz and wrap around you. But this is one of the elms. Where is its label? Is it way down there?
There it is.
Yeah.
Ulmus minor, subspecies minor, and pendula.
Do they give a common name to that species of elm?
Weeping smoothleaf elm.
Okay, it's Ulmus minor, the smoothleaf elm, because over that way there's a weeping camperdown elm, which is probably the better known of the weeping elms. You walked under a weeping form of our native hornbeam, not anywhere near as striking as the weeping form of the European hornbeam, Corpinus, but I found the original plant of that in the woods, and I found it one winter, and I saw it and I thought, well, what is a weeping cherry doing in the woods? Maybe the difference was in the shade, it assumes a more weeping habit than it has here. But given time, it's developing a more weeping habit as the limbs extend further.
Would that be considered an understory tree then?
Oh yeah, our native ironwood, Carpinus caroliniana, or ironwood or musclewood, is an understory tree. Yeah, it's about dogwood size, maybe a little bit bigger. In the wild, most often you often find it in floodplains. The trunks are gorgeous. They're all sinewy, which is why it's called musclewood. But it's also a very dense wood. It's not ever showy, like a flowering cherry or something like that, but it's always beautiful. We have quite a few Asian species of Carpinus in the Arboretum. Weeping form of mimosa, one of the Prunus incisors. If we don't get to it, just below the building, and then over in either Oak Grove or Plantsman's Wood, which is right on the other side of the mixed border, there's another selection of Prunus incisor that's been in bloom for maybe about 6 weeks and will continue blooming all winter. It's the cultivar is Shikizaki. But this is a pretty growth habit. My favorite columnar plant is, actually this is, we were just talking about Carpinus ironwood. This is this is a columnar form of the European ironwood, Carpinus betulus. There's this one stays really tight. I think when it comes to a lot of columnar trees, a lot of them suffer from middle age. What is the expression? Middle age spread? Is that the expression? It doesn't sound right to me, because they start off in youth and as a young tree, nice and tight, but fairly quickly get very wide. The selection of the European ironwood that's widely available in the nursery trade is a cultivar called Franz Fontaine, and there's one down by that little wooden gate where you leave the Arboretum, go out into the Hort students area. It's probably at least 20 feet wide, and that's one that's sold as a columnar tree. Well, it's columnar when it's 10 years old, maybe 15 years old, but it gets wider and wider. A lot of towns cut down the willow oaks that are in the Hell Strip and plant that columnar ironwood, and then when it gets really wide, then nobody's able to walk down the sidewalk. But this is a gorgeous, really tightly columnar selection. It's Columnaris nana. Not widely available, but something that maybe I'm going to try to make available when we have our plant sale or something.
Doug,
Yeah.
how did the columnar and the weeping trees fare in the ice storms? Do they have any more damage than normal shaped trees?
I wouldn't say so. Probably not all of you heard Marilyn's question. Her question was, and some of you might have answers to this question, how do columnar and plants with a weeping habit fare in ice storms and snowstorms? I tend to think that they don't suffer more than other plants, but I'm happy to hear what other people say.
We have a holly columnar one.
Yeah.
And with the leaves on it, I wrap it.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, sky pencil, you got to wrap.
Yeah.
This gentleman I've known for close to 40 years, and I don't have any trouble remembering his name because his name is Doug.
Yeah, but, so it's very handy.
Yeah. Doug made the point that he has a holly. Was it a Yopon holly? Well, he has a columnar holly that he says he wraps when the snow or ice is predicted to keep it from splitting open. And indeed, that was a point I was going to make. I think growth habit isn't as much a factor in an ice storm or a snowstorm. I think being evergreen is the bigger issue because you have all that leaf surface holding on to snow or ice. I was really worried about that with that snow we had 3 weeks ago, how long ago?
Sure.
Because there were still a fair number of leaves and some oaks and stuff. And I remember that ice storm probably about 2002 or 3. And there were brown already, but there was tons of leaves and willow oaks and white oaks, and that held on to ice, and the damage was so much more than if it had happened just a few weeks later. This is Mahonia media. Mahonia medias are interspecific hybrids, and that's winter sun. I have never seen the Mahonias bloom so beautifully as they do this year. They always start in December or so, and then usually it's late December, January, we get really cold, and then the flowers are pretty much destroyed for the rest of the winter. But the extended warm or frost-free period we're having, they've really come out, and they're absolutely amazing. But it also, most of us are well acquainted with Mahonia belii, the common Oregon grape holly. It might get 5 feet tall, it might get 6 foot tall, but mostly sort of 5 foot tall or so. This certainly makes the point that the media hybrids, which are half Mahonia belii or similar species, are very much bigger plants, and I've seen them twice the height of this. If you want to see a big one, when you go down to the necessary, just sort of backed up on the backside of the necessary is another media hybrid, Author Menzies, and it's gigantic, but it's also absolutely glorious. Did I say they're fragrant? They have a lovely fragrance. To my nose, it smells a lot like Lily of the Valley. Behind some of us is a really beautiful camellia. It's one of my favorites, maybe my top 2,000 or 3,000 favorite camellias.
Discerning, aren't you?
Yeah. There's a small group of Camellia hybrids that are Camellia X Vernalis. Again, we heard Vernalis with that native witch hazel, meaning of spring. The Vernalis are thought to be, the earliest ones were thought to be chance hybrids between Camellia sasanqua and Camellia japonica. They're much faster growing than most japonicas. Some japonicas, slowly, sort of almost creakingly get up to maybe about 5 feet, and 30 years later they're gigantic. But the Vernalis are much more vigorous growing from their sasanqua parent, and they will bloom on and off through mild spells in the winter. And I don't think I ever mentioned this one's name. In the nursery trade, if you see one called Dawn, that's generally the name it goes under in this country, but its true cultivar name is Jinryu, Ginryu. With the RYU, you're probably guessing it sounds like a Japanese name, and it is a Japanese name. It means something like silver dragon. But you see the big evergreen holly behind it? I've seen some plants of this almost that size, so in time they get quite large. And someone is going to say, when do I prune my camellias? Well, camellias do not need regular pruning. They are small trees with permanent stems. There is pruning you can do if you need to keep them to a more moderate size, but they do not have to be pruned. So if you don't have any reason to prune your camellias, just go, back in the house and sit down and, have a cup of coffee or something. We've seen our native Ozark witch hazel a couple times already today. This is just the wild type. This is a real dwarf one, Quasimodo. Starting out sort of reddish, but then it'll get more sort of buff colored. Most witch hazels are large shrubs, so if you're pressed for room, this dwarf one is much smaller than the wild type. I think there's a dwarf form of our other native Camellias virginiana, but I don't remember the cultivar name. Virginiana is generally yellow flowered and fall blooming, so it's already done blooming. The hybrids are propagated by grafting, and they're mostly winter to early spring blooming. So if you have stems on it that are blooming yellow in the fall, that's the understock, because when you buy a grafted witch hazel, it's almost 100% guaranteed that the understock is going to put up shoots, and you're going to have to cut them out so they don't overwhelm the desirable variety. And if you study them, you can usually see enough difference in the foliage that you can decide that you have some above. If you're not sure, then wait till the winter, and the stems that are blooming with the big showy flowers, of course, are the plants you bought, and any of them that are either not blooming or have puny little flowers like our native wild ones do, then you'll know which stems to cut out and which to leave. Winter sweet, Camellias praecox meaning precocious, usually starts to bloom in December, and often by early January we've had low enough temperatures that it's no longer real showy looking, so we're getting to see a really good display of it. It's also very fragrant. I'm guessing that a lot of winter blooming plants have to go the extra mile to attract pollinators, so we'll have colorful flowers, but also a lot of very attractive fragrance as well. This is the cultivar luteus. Is also concolor, and they're worth seeking out because wild type Camellias praecox can often have these sort of milky white flowers. They don't show up much at all. Now, if you found fruit on these and you grew them from seed, you might end up with nicely colored flowers, but you wouldn't be guaranteed. So you might want to spend a little extra money and buy one that was grown from cuttings, so you're going to get a nice yellow flower. Well, as we go through the winter garden, we might see an example of winter sweet with wishy-washy white flowers. Oh, I know one thing. We're going to see a few of the Chinese magnolias, but if you have time, go up on the roof of the building, and if you go to the far end on the driveway side of the building, you'll be up 20 feet up into the magnolia that's blooming there, and stick your nose in that. That's a really good fragrance. Winter sweet is closely related to calycanthus, or sweet Betsy, or Carolina allspice, and the fruit looks identical. I always think it looks like a bat that's resting in the tree. It's a black-brown fruit that hangs down from the branches. They're easy to grow from seed. There are a number of, this is the same genus, Camellias, but evergreen ones, and this one blooms in the fall. It has milky white flowers. They're sort of spidery looking, smaller than those flowers, and they're sort of like the flowers of Elysium, the star anise, where they smell a little bit like fish that's no longer fresh enough to bother buying. There's another Chinese species we have that has a much prettier habit and prettier leaf, and also white flowered and done blooming, but the fragrance isn't quite as good. Oh yeah, this is Camellias nitens. They're from China. You're welcome to come back in here. I just mentioned the magnolia to look at from the roof of the building. This is a very similar species. These are both evergreen magnolias from China, and you see they're extremely similar. You can tell one difference. This has those nice chocolate brown fuzzy buds, and this has a smooth bud, but otherwise the foliage looks very much alike, and this isn't yet blooming, but the flowers will look very much alike. And not too many years ago, they weren't considered to be Magnolias, but Camellias, or was it Magnolias? I always forget. But now they're all lumped in with the Magnolias, and if you look at the the floral parts and stuff, I think you'll agree it looks a lot like a magnolia. But I'm seeing a lot of dead twigs on this one. Last winter when it was so cold, a lot of these evergreen magnolias got clobbered. Indeed, the one that's right up against the McSwain building, I think it almost totally defoliated and lost a lot of growth, but fleshed back out and is now blooming again.
What's their name, Doug?
It says
They're magnolias.
Okay.
This one, reading the label, is Magnolia Maudier. Glaucous underside of the leaf. This one's label is in my office, so we'll go to my office and read it. We had an irrigation repair to make here back in July, and the label I took in my office for safekeeping, and I failed to put it back. But this is the same species as is blooming in the Japanese garden. Well, I forget the actual species, but it's Magnolia something, and then the subspecies Cavallerii. And indeed, when we get out on the lawn, if you look towards the lath house, you'll see this big cloud of white over the lath house, and that's this species in full bloom. All right, we'll go back out this way and continue through the winter
Doug,
garden.
do these propagate well?
The question was, do they propagate well? Do you mean, do they root readily?
Yeah,
I
can
don't
you take
think they
cuttings? I mean, how do you, or do you grow from seed or what?
We had someone in propagation workshop try several times and not worth the effort.
Okay.
Yeah, I think more often they're grafted. I think they're difficult to root. Now these are species, so if they set fruit, I'm sure you could raise them from seed. But flowering this time of year, the flowers probably more often than not get destroyed, so they don't end up making any fruit. I suspect the climate in China is different than here. One of the shrubby dogwoods that's grown for its colorful twigs. This one is Midwinter Fire. We passed by a little scrap of a very similar cultivar, but it's the newer stems that are more brightly colored. So the English and others often cut them to the ground every spring, so all the growth is brand new, but some of these don't really. This isn't their absolute favorite climate, especially the red and yellow twig dogwoods, which are different species than this one. I think sometimes cutting them to the ground every year is a little bit too stressful, so I'll just cut back parts of them, and every few years to encourage more new growth, but I don't cut them back severely. You can see this was cut back by our winter garden volunteers. You can see where they cut it back most recently. But beautiful stems, and most of them can be rooted by just sticking the stems in the ground where you want a new plant, or stick them in a pot and plant them later on. They'll just root this time of year. I just want to point out that we don't think of maples as being evergreen, but there's actually quite a few Asian species of maple that are evergreen, and this is one of them. This is Acer fabri. Not only does it differ in being evergreen, but if you look at the leaf, I don't think that leaf looks particularly like a maple, but I'm sure the fruit does. It's Acer fabri. This is sometimes it's probably almost shocking when we talk about a native plant at the Arboretum, but this is a local woodland native. It's actually the same family as collard and mustard greens. In the mustard family, it's Cardamine, diphylla meaning two leaves. You see the leaf is divided into three, but I guess it produces two leaves. It's slowly spreading, completely disappears in the summer, comes up in the fall, has foliage through the winter months, and little white flowers in the spring, which are okay, but I would grow it just for its foliage. If the foliage wasn't so handsome, I probably wouldn't grow it just for its flowers, but that's the kind of thing you could plant in dry shade where a shrub might cover the ground in the summer, but when the shrub is leafless, it's nice to have this touch of green on the ground. Now, why would that grow through the winter months? Well, woodlands are often very shady and dry in the summer, so it's making use of the sunlight and readily available moisture through the winter months. Let's see. We met Camellia Vernalis earlier at the top of the weeping walk. The white one that called Jinryu that I said is in the nursery trade is Dawn. This and the white and pink one over there, not this purplish one right behind us, are two selections of another Vernalis called Yigao. Yigao is Chinese for smiling face. This is Yigao shibori. Sometimes you have a cultivar which then mutates to a new cultivar, but they've retained the original cultivar Yigao. And Yigao shibori has these wiggly stems, which is different from the regular Yigao. But a really curious thing, all the other Yigao selections are open-centered like that one, but this one not only has the corkscrew stems, but many more petaloids in the center. Now that white one with the pink mottling is also Yigao, but it's Yigao variegated. And in the camellia world, in some countries like the US, people actually intentionally introduce virus into camellias, and that's what caused that. Actually, the typical color of Yigao is this, but if you introduce the virus, then you get all this white mottling, and in this case, it's more white than pink. It's a virus that affects the expression of color in the flowers, and if a camellia has that virus in it, then you'll also occasionally see a green leaf with some yellow mottling in it. It's the same virus doing that. Some countries, when it comes to camellia shows and stuff, they don't allow the virused camellias. But in this country, maybe like back in the 1940s and 50s, camellia shows were a really big thing. It was sort of like, the prom or the coming out ball, the debutante ball or something. The camellia show was a really big event in town. And, you got, the more points you got, the more ribbons you got, all added up to grand total. And if you had the largest number of ribbons, you were the grand prize winner for the whole show. So, if you had the regular pink Yigao, but you also grafted it onto a virused understock and you ended up with the variegated Yigao, well then you had not one but two different camellias to exhibit. So, in this country at least, the virus was intentionally introduced into camellias. It's not something, I don't think it's ever spread by insects. I wonder if it might be spread by pruning tools, but it doesn't debilitate the plant significantly, but it's odd when you hear people intentionally introducing a virus. It's sort of late in the year for sasanquas, but this is a sasanqua here. Greens, blues. Bobby Green is a nurseryman in New Fairhope, Alabama, which is near Mobile, and at one point he had an email address of Mr. Sasanqua, so he loves sasanquas, and I love sasanquas. They're really beautiful garden shrubs. They're not very good cut flowers because the flowers usually shatter within a day of being cut. I mentioned this Mahonia earlier today. This is Arthur Menzies. It's another hybrid one, and I think this might have been the first of the media hybrids, and this was one that I believe it was planted during JC's time. I think he planted it, but you see how big they get. Keep that in mind when you're planting them. The media hybrids are much more sun tolerant than the common leatherleaf Mahonia or Oregon grape holly. I've seen them being grown in full sun in hotter climates, and this such as Columbia, South Carolina. Mahoney abelii won't die if you put it out in the sun, but it's going to look really miserable. The foliage will be bleached out. Notice all the honeybees visiting the flowers. Well, I think we've seen a lot of the highlights of winter. I haven't touched on all that many architectural trees, but the architectural plants, but the thing is they're present year round. You know, I really like the dwarf palms, our native dwarf palmetto there with those big exclamation points of leaves. But, you know, I don't know.
How about a blue tree?
Yeah, well, you know.
There used to be red.
I think Doug's speechless.
I don't remember if
It was red and white polka dot.
Yeah, that's right. It was sort of almost. It was about the color of Lynn's jacket, with white polka dots. That's right. But it wasn't paint. It was its pajamas. It was fabric. And it's been many years since we've done it. But we used to paint the grasses and other winter things in the perennial border, and it was highly likely that we were going to do it this winter, but the snow broke most things down. So a lot of the herbaceous perennials we left in the past would normally leave for winter interest. We're cutting down now because the snow has already broken them down. So we probably won't do any painting in the perennial border this winter.
Is it dead?
Is what? The tree? Yeah, the tree is dead. Yeah. It was the original plant of lace parasol winged elm, which is one of our native elms, Ulmus alata, is that right?
Yes.
Alata meaning winged, and the original plant was found in the wild in Chatham County and was brought here and probably died of Dutch elm disease, but the winged elm is also one of those early succession trees that doesn't live to be, you know, grand old specimens, sort of live fast, die young growth habit. And this had a slight winging to it, but you've probably noticed how sometimes sweet gums have a huge amount of corky wings on the stem. Some winged elms will have a lot. We do have a new plant of it in the ground. It's been in the ground almost a year. And if you remember where we started out, first thing, where we saw on the brick circle, it's on that slope below there. It's not much taller than me with a head about like this, but you know, it'll be a nice replacement for this one. It's a really beautiful. What?
It's not blue yet.
No, many years before it turns blue. Yeah, they only turn blue in great age. There's another. We can head that way because it's sort of on our way. This isn't what I came over to show you, but I'm glad we're standing here. I mentioned we saw that really beautiful weeping Prunus incisor, and I said there is another cultivar that blooms all winter. This is it. This is the Shikizaki, which is Shikizaka, I guess Japanese cultivar name. You know, color's a little dingy, but it's blooming all winter. You can't beat that. But what I came to show you we were looking at the blue-stemmed winged elm over there, and that was the original plant of that. Well, this is the original plant of a weeping native beech tree, Fagus grandiflora. It has the name of white lightning. At least when it was younger, the stems were quite white. This was found locally. I don't remember what, it was some county around here. But this woman contacted the Arboretum and said, I have this odd little tree. I'm not quoting her exactly, but the story was something along this line. I have this odd little tree that you might want, and if you want it, you got to come and get it because my husband is just going to drive over it with the all-terrain vehicle. So What?
No wonder it's weeping.
Yeah, and that's how it came to be here. It was quite slow and small in its early years. Now it's growing very vigorously. So I think maybe we're going to need to relocate it. We have not yet propagated it. Beeches are propagated by grafting. A newish employee here, Leanne Keneally, is working primarily with Denny Warner in his redbud breeding, but there's times when he doesn't need her time, so then we benefit from her help. And she has done grafting, so I'm encouraging her to try grafting that so we can produce some plants of this here. But there's so many cultivars of the European beech. It'd be nice to have a very striking weeping form of our native beech.
That's the only one that there is.
It's the only, this is the original plant of this cultivar. It's the only one I know of. I sent scions to a nurseryman who requested them. I haven't heard whether he has succeeded in grafting them. So there might be 30 others at his nursery. I don't know, I should ask him. But I'm pretty excited about the plant.
The volunteer hasn't picked the leaves off yet.
Well,
You can get started.
Well, we got a whole bunch of people here right now, Doug.
There's no reason to pick its leaves off. Well, of course, I'm
was
just
just
saying.
kidding.
I know you're kidding, because they're not. These leaves are not hiding flowers, which is the case with redbuds, not redbuds, witch hazels. I'm not used to talking much at all, so by the time I'm done with one of these presentations, I can hardly talk, make sense at all. And there's, I think it's so beautiful in our native woodlands this time of year when you see if there's a lot of beech, you have all these brown leaves, especially when they're backlit, and it's just it's only occurs on the juvenile, the younger parts of the trees. When they get taller, the more mature parts of the trees do not retain their leaves, and like the younger parts. It's called the cone of juvenility. You see that on some oaks where, 8 feet or down, you'll see those branches will hold the leaves, but the limbs above that do not. Well, should we call it a day? Yes, Charlie. No, ask a question.
If this has seedlings, will some of them be weeping? Who knows?
I routinely see. I've often seen weeping cherries come up from seed. So yeah, sometimes the weeping habit is genetic and the seedlings can exhibit that habit. This was not a sport. So many of our variegated plants were originally a single variegated branch on a green plant, and so that's not a mutation in the flowers of the plant. But this arose as a weeping seedling, so it has the genes for weeping, so its seedlings could potentially be weeping. Just like a lot of plants with red or yellow leaves often produce plants with seedlings with red or yellow leaves. Variegated plants usually almost never do, or the few plants, sometimes variegation occurs with the seedling, and like I've sown seeds of variegated yucca and variegated iris insata, and their seedlings were albinos. They had no green at all. But most of our variegated plants, especially woody plants, are started off just as a somatic mutation, just a branch spore. So it could be interesting to grow this from seed. And sort of along that line, Tim collected a bunch of pine cones off our dwarf loblollies. We're going to sow the seeds, and a lot of those seedlings will probably exhibit some degree of dwarfism. He said, Tim's been here about a dozen years. He said long time ago they did that, and I think maybe just putting plants in the plant giveaway if we produce seedlings. I'm going to charge a bunch of money for them. Because we forever get people asking, where can I buy a dwarf loblolly? Well, we haven't been able to find a nursery that's grafting them. And, you know, a fresh seedling could be really fun. You look at you can't see them from here, but that grove of dwarf loblollies, and there's a lot of variations. No, they're all seedlings, and they're pretty variable. Shall we call it? I'm happy. Are there any more questions? All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming out.